Good evening. Welcome to episode 4 of The Gospel Comes to Greece. So just a couple of words before we kind of officially begin. I'm happy to get some emails, not from you, but from those who are watching or live streaming or recording. I actually went on YouTube and saw that, yes, there are actually quite a few people who watch these things. So I'm kind of encouraged that in addition to the bodies that are helping me realize that there is actually someone listening and awake, and all that, we also have a number of people who are kind of snooping in, so to say, right? Both live streaming and afterwards. So welcome to those of you who are watching this remotely. Also, let me say again, a shameless plug, but I remember I lead these biblical tours. So not just to Greece, because one of the emails said to me, we've been to Israel, the Holy Land, but we've never been to Greece, and your presentation is really whetting our appetite, for Greece, and maybe that's the case. So I have tours to Greece, which you might want to consider. I have a tour coming up to Turkey. Turkey is a very safe and archaeologically really a fascinating place. And biblically speaking, there are more Bible sites in Turkey than there are in Greece, for instance. And then I have a tour once in a while to Italy, and then also a tour to Israel and Jordan. So again, if you have any questions about that, email me. You can snoop on my website. And for instance, I have a trip to Israel and Jordan coming up pretty soon, and one to Turkey after that. One other final preliminary comment, and that is, so this is week 4 in The Gospel Comes to Greek. And week 4 is a little different than the other 3 weeks. And you say, of course it is, because we have a different city. Well, I'm saying in addition to that. So in week 1, the Gospel came to Philippi, and we looked at the Acts text, Acts 16, quite in detail. And I had to live up to my high school nickname on Motormouth, because there was a lot of text in there, right, in order to squeak it in. And then the next week, the Gospel comes to Thessalonica, and that's chapter 17, only 10 verses, and I didn't have to speak as fast, and so that was kind of nice. And then last week, the Gospel came to Athens, and chapter 18, there were 19 verses, so a little bit tough, but not too bad. And now we have the Gospel comes to Corinth. But tonight, instead of looking in detail on Acts 18, when the Gospel comes to Corinth, we're going to be looking at the ongoing relationship that Paul had with the Corinthian church, because Acts 18 is only the first of a rather complicated and not so happy saga that Paul had with the Corinthian congregations. And so tonight I'm going to kind of lay out what that saga is, so that for the rest of your life, whenever you read 1 Corinthians, whenever you read any passage from 2 Corinthians, or if you ever look at Acts 18, you'll be able to kind of put those texts within that saga, all right? So that's why the title is a little bit different. You can already see where we're going with this. Paul and the Corinthian church, and up, and, well, we're going to see quite a bit of time, a down relationship, all right? So this week is a little bit different because we're going to be looking at this lengthy, complicated relationship that the Apostle Paul had with the Christians in Corinth. So, let's begin. So our first slide is this. The first of, and notice I'm going to stress, 3 visits to Corinth. You might be puzzled because if you took some kind of, Bible presentation about Paul's life, you would have learned that there were only 2 visits. And so tonight you're going to realize that there are actually 3. And how many Corinthian letters are there? Yeah, you've thought all your life that there were 2, but I'm going to tell you tonight that there are actually 4. Oh, well, you're already shocked already. Anyway, so I'm just stressing the fact, I don't want you to confuse all the details. So this is visit number 1 of not 2, but ultimately 3 visits. And pretty soon we're going to hear about not 1, not 2, not 3, but would you believe it, 4 letters the Apostle Paul wrote to this particular congregation. So this is where the gospel comes to Corinth, first of all. This is the story. You can read about it in Acts 18. You can see there are 18 verses. So let's just backtrack for a little bit. If you look on the map, I don't dare shine on here, but remember it starts the second missionary journey over there in Antioch of Syria, way there on your left. And then we had Paul and Silas. They pick up Timothy along the way. The gospel comes to Philippi. Down the Via Egnatia, the gospel comes to Thessalonica. Paul's run out of town. He goes to Berea. The brothers take him to Athens with instructions for Paul and Silas to join him as soon as possible. They join him in Athens, and then Paul sends them packing back up north. So that means that Paul is left in Athens all alone. Dare I do this one more time? All by myself. Paul is ministering in Athens all by himself. So that's what happens. And we saw last week that, hey, if the gospel can make it there, it can make it anywhere. And we talked about those two big converts and so forth. But finally then, Paul now, and that's what we're doing this week, he leaves Athens, just a smallish town, faded from its former glory, and he goes down the road, not too far, to the city of Corinth. Corinth, a top 10 city of the ancient world, bigger than Philippi, bigger than Thessalonica, 80 to 100,000. No wonder Paul went to the metropolis, the bustling town of Corinth. And unlike Philippi, where he was only there for a little while, unlike Thessalonica, where he was run out of town in 3+ Sabbaths, unlike Berea, where he was left town very, very quickly, unlike Athens, where he wasn't very long, in Corinth, he's there for a year and a half. A year and a half. He's got some time to share the gospel. He's got some time not just to share the gospel, but maybe to teach them at a deeper level. And what happens now during this first visit, which you now know lasts a year and a half? What happens during this first visit of a year and a half? Well, Paul comes into town all alone. In fact, in 1 Corinthians, he hasn't written this letter yet, Paul will say, when I came to you on this first visit for a year and a half, I came not with fine-sounding arguments, like you wanted me to do, but I came with fear and trembling. I'm just slowing down because that's not just exaggeration. You know the story, right? What happened to Paul in Philippi? He was thrown into jail. He was beaten severely, right? Okay. Went to Thessalonica, he was run out of town. He had to sneak away in the middle of the night. Went to Berea, he got run out of town. Went to Athens, so it was not bad, but of course they all laughed when he got to the resurrection. And now he comes to Corinth, and no wonder he comes to Corinth with fear and trembling. I want you to appreciate what it would have been like for the apostle, right? I mean, you think that he's a cocky, self-assured guy. He would never be afraid or anything. No. So he came with fear and trembling for a year and a half. And God opens the door because I've said to you before, everywhere he goes, he needs to connect with somebody who's, well, frankly, rich. Right? Why? Because he needs that rich person, because only rich people have a house. And the church needs to meet somewhere because it's not an officially recognized religion, so he needs a rich person who's going to allow their house to be the meeting place for the baby church. And God opens the door and he meets a Jewish couple, Aquila and Priscilla. They are not from Corinth. They're from far away Rome. And you're saying, Jeff, if they're from Rome, what are they doing in the city of Corinth? I'm glad you asked, because the answer is Emperor Claudius, he heard that there were Jews fighting within his city over a certain Chrestus. Sounds like Christ. Anyway, that we can't have people violating the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, and so Claudius, he kicks all the Jews out of Rome. That's what he did. Emperors can do that, right? And so poor Priscilla and Aquila, rich and powerful though they might be, they had to pick up all their belongings, and I don't know how they ended up, but they went to another big city. They ended up in Corinth, and God in his providence allows Paul, all by himself at this stage, to connect with Priscilla and Aquila. And they connected apparently because they had business in common. They both worked in leather. And so you know Paul's modus operandi. When he first comes into town, he doesn't take money because people accuse him of having selfish motives. So he engages in self-sufficient work, right? We even have that expression, a tent-making ministry, right? That's a pastor who's bivocational, right? And Paul was bivocational, right? He was working with Priscilla and Aquila during the week, right? Providing for himself. And then on the Sabbaths, you'll not at all be surprised if you've been before, he does what he always does in every other city. What does he do on the Sabbath? He goes to of course he does, right? He went to the Harvard School of Judaism, right? He's got a ready-made audience. And so he maybe drops the name of Gamaliel or some other impressive people, and the door's open for him, and he preaches in the synagogue. Now, during this time, while he's working during the week and preaching in the synagogue, his two helpers, his co-missionaries, Silas and Timothy, come from the north. Remember, he sent them to the north. They come back. And, Paul is really eager to hear what Timothy might say about Thessalonica, because there's some baby Christians there, and they're under persecution. Paul was worried about what would happen, and Timothy comes back and goes thumbs up and thumbs up, okay? Good news. But he still shares some other things, and so Paul sits down and writes a letter. That's the letter you know called 1 Thessalonians. That happened while Paul was in Corinth, right at this stage. Some other things happen. You have to ask me about it another time, maybe another year. We can talk about the Thessalonians. I happen to know something about those letters. Anyway, he wrote 2 Thessalonians. So Silas and Timothy come from the north, not only with the good news, but with some cash. Remember, Paul's modus operandi is, I don't get any money from you when I'm in your place, because I don't want you or anyone else to think that I have wrong motives. But once I leave, then I expect you to contribute, right? And that's what they did. And so they come with some money, which allows Paul to kind of give up maybe almost his day job, working with tents with Priscilla and Aquila, and concentrate on full-time preaching. And Paul will shame the Corinthians later on. If I ever make it to the end of this presentation, you'll see that Paul will later on use this to shame them, because Paul's working on this collection later on in his life, and he hoping the Corinthians will contribute to this collection, and you're going to see that this was not only an up relationship, but unfortunately also a down relationship. The Corinthians didn't want to pay, and Paul's going to use this information to shame them. So Paul will later on say to them, to the Corinthians, when I was with you, I preached the gospel for free. You didn't pay for a cent. He says, well, actually, it wasn't free. Somebody else footed the bill. It was the Christians up there in the north, in Macedonia. I mean, this is right, because Silas and Timothy come with that money, and Paul's preaching the gospel. For how long again? I forgot. How long is he there? Oh, good. Thank you. 1.5 years. Now, so far so good, but there's conflict. And I already went ahead. The conflict is from the local Jews, because Paul is probably stealing some members from the synagogue. They also think that Paul is probably preaching blasphemy. And so, first of all, they privately blaspheme him, right? They would spread malicious gossip about Paul. But that wasn't enough. I don't know about you, but, malicious gossip isn't nice, right? So that would be like you on the way out, like, oh, Weima was boring, you know what I mean? Or he's such a lame professor, or that would be like gossip, right? But it would be another thing if a bunch of you pulled your resource together and say, I think we should write a letter to the president of Calvin Theological Seminary, lodging some official charges against, you see, okay. This is what the Jews did. So early on, it was just kind of the malicious stuff, but then we read about they made a united attack. Do you see that? And they didn't go to the president. They went even better than that of the seminary. They went to the governor of the whole province of Achaia. So Greece wasn't called Greece in the ancient world. Northern part, Macedonia. Southern part is Achaia. Corinth is part of Achaia. And the heavyweight, the most important person representing Rome, was the proconsul. And we know his name, and we know exactly when he lived. Do I have a picture over here? They brought him before Gallio. Gallio was his name. And we almost know exactly where that happened. Some of you, because you're very, very bright, know that I've shown pictures of cities. And wait a minute, there's a large rectangular open place in every city, right? An agora or a forum, right? And I said to you, there's a bema, a speaker's platform, either in the center or in the front. And here's the actual bema, the foundation for it in Corinth, right there. And that's an excellent, the Acts text right there, Acts 18, says they brought him to the Weima. Even if you know Greek, you can see it right over there, the seat of judgment. So the Jews bring a formal charge against Paul, against Gallio. And Gallio looks at these Jews and, see, he doesn't understand the difference between Jews and Christians. They look all the same, don't they? I mean, they can. They both believe in the one and same God, okay, right? Okay. So he listens to all of them and he goes, this is just some internal Jewish matter. I'm not going to jail, okay? Okay. Actually, it's good news because that means there's no negative judgment against the Christian church in Corinth, right? Paul can keep on ministering. The Christians who are there can keep on doing their own thing, right? They're not doing anything illegal yet. And some other things happen, but Paul, of course, is kicked out of the synagogue. You can't come here anymore. He sets up shop next door, and some other things happen. But we need to get to, as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story. So far in the story, we have only the first of 3 more visits. Only the first visit. How long was it again? 1.5 years. That's right. So after 1.5 years, Paul finally is going to leave. Okay, so he says goodbye to, I guess the people who are in charge. Okay, there's a church over there. I've been ministering for 1.5 years. You guys are mature enough to go on your own, but now God is calling me to go somewhere. And along with me are Priscilla and Aquila. Maybe Silas and Timothy, we're not sure. And so the first thing Paul has to do is he has to go from, boy, I wish you could see. You see where Corinth is located? Do you know the word Peloponnesus, that whole big green thing in the bottom? That's almost an island, except for 4 miles. There's a little piece of land connecting, and Corinth is located right there. That's one of the reasons why it's so successful. Anyway, if you're going to go west, you have a harbor over there. But if you're going to go east, you have a harbor in the other direction. And Paul wants to go east. He's heading to Jerusalem, and so he's going east. So he goes to a place called Cenchrea. Do you see on the map there with the C? Either Cenchrea or Cenchrea. We don't know whether the kappa is hard or soft. Anyway, so Paul goes a very short distance by land from Corinth to the harbor going east. And remember, he's with Priscilla and Aquila, maybe with 2 others. And before he gets on the boat, what happens? He gets a haircut. I'm kidding. I'm not kidding. He gets a haircut. Yes, okay. So that's another little story. That has to do with a Nazirite vow, all right? And so that's another interesting detail about what's Paul doing with a Nazirite vow. Cutting the hair is at the end of the vow, and he's probably taking the hair and he's going to bring it to the temple in Jerusalem as part of some other things that are going on. But Paul gets a haircut. The other interesting thing is we're introduced, to the port city of Cenchrea, and that catches my attention because later on in Paul's life, he's going to write a letter to the Romans. You're saying, Jeff, you're overloading me with stuff about the Corinthians. I can't think about the Romans. Well, anyway, so the Romans, and at the very end of Romans, almost certainly the person who is carrying the letter, Romans 16, verse 1, there's a woman named Phoebe, who's called the diakonos of Greek, of the church of Cenchrea. Okay? I don't want to insult you, but it'd be pretty hard for Phoebe to be a diakonos of the church of Cenchrea if there was no church in Cenchrea. Do you see what I'm getting at? Okay, so when we think about the gospel coming to Corinth, we should say, I guess it's not just coming to Corinth, but it's coming to other areas too. Just like Ephesus is a major city and the 3rd major, and the gospel goes all around the surrounding areas, so also Corinth is a major city and the gospel is going in all other areas. Here's another clue. In 2 Corinthians, which hasn't been written yet, but Paul will greet all the saints who live in the whole of Achaia. Do you see that? Remember, Achaia is the provincial name for all of southern Greece. So there had to be other Christians living in the whole province of Achaia, other than the one place we know of, Corinth, and I just gave you another place, the port city of Cenchrea. So during that 1.5 years, the gospel must be going out to all kinds of places in the Peloponnesus, in the province of Achaia. Anyway, so Paul's got a new haircut, got the hair with him, okay, part of the Nazirite vow. He's got Priscilla and Aquila with him, and they sail. They sail across, by the way, that's the remains of the harbor. Do you see the bottom picture? You see the white underneath? That's the break wall. It's called a mole, M-O-L-E. Do you see on both sides? See, because ships would come in the middle, and that would be protected from that's what's left of one of the most bustling harbors of the ancient world. It's one of the two harbors from the city of Corinth. And we go there and we stand on the shore and talk about some of these things. Anyway, so they sail. So on the map, you see the arrow going to the left. They sail to Ephesus. It's still part of the second missionary journey. The Jewish people over there, again, are everywhere they go. Paul is welcomed by Jewish people, and he does some ministry in the synagogue, and they say, you're an interesting guy. Stick around for a while. And Paul says, no. I'm on my way to, where's he going to? Jerusalem, that's right. And but if the Lord allows me, I'm going to come back. I've been wanting to come here for a while. If the Lord allows me, I'm going to come back. And so Priscilla and Aquila stay behind. The Jewish couple, the rich Jewish couple, the rich Christian Jewish couple stay behind in Ephesus. And Paul sails down right off the map to Jerusalem. There it is, Jerusalem. Paul goes up to see the brothers and sisters in Jerusalem, and then he goes up to Antioch. Remember, Antioch is where the journey started. Phew! End of second missionary journey. But not the end of the story of Paul and the Corinthians. We've got a long way to go, so brace yourself. Are you ready? We finished the second missionary journey, the first visit to Corinth, 18 months. Now we're going to start the third missionary journey. Are you ready to go on the third missionary journey? Okay, we're going to talk about Corinth part. So here we go on the third missionary journey. Paul says goodbye to the Christians in Antioch church, and unlike the second missionary journey where Paul wanted to go north to Bithynia, and the Spirit said no. And Paul wanted to go west toward Ephesus, and the Spirit said no. And instead he ended up in Troas, where he had the Macedonian vision. That's the gospel comes to Philippi. Hopefully you remember that. This time, apparently, the Spirit did allow Paul to go west, and he lands in the city of Ephesus. Look at there on the map. And you ready? Guess how long he's there for? 2 years and 3 months. 2 years and 3 months. And all the details I'm going to be talking about for the next long while happen within that 2 years and 3 months. Where's Paul? I'm going to ask you a couple of times. He's in the city of Ephesus. So in your mind, see, there it is on Turkey, on western shore of Turkey. He's in Ephesus. By the way, Ephesus is the third or fourth largest city in the ancient world, 250,000. He's there for 2 years and 3 months, and a bunch of things happen. And I'm going to just highlight the things that happen as they relate to the Church of Corinth. All right, are you with me? So in your mind, there he is, okay? See where Corinth is? Across the Aegean Sea, right? He's a little ways away, but okay. So 2 years and 3 months, and Corinth is going to be part of this 2 year, 3 month story. Other things, of course, are happening too, because Paul's involved with mission all in that area, but he doesn't abandon the Corinthian church, and a bunch of things happen to him while he's there. What's the first thing that happens to him? Paul writes a letter to them. And I've already told you that how many letters did he write to the Corinthians? Not 2 like you think, but 4. So this is the real 1 Corinthians, which we don't have. It's lost. And skeptic that you are, you say, Brother Jeff, how do you know that he wrote a letter to the Corinthians? I say, I'm glad you asked. Okay? Because in our 1 Corinthians, which is going to be second, right? Paul says something in 1 Corinthians 5:9, and then he contrasts it with what he says in 1 Corinthians 5:11. So in 5:9 he said, I wrote, past tense, right? So somewhere in the past I wrote you not to associate with sexually immoral people, but now I am writing to you. Do you see the difference? So there was a letter before 1 Corinthians, there was a letter. We don't have that letter. We don't know what was in it except for one thing at least. We know at least that Paul said to the Corinthians, you ready? Don't hang out with sexually immoral people. That's what Paul had to say to them. I don't want to read too much into it, but they must have been hanging out with sexually immoral people, right? That Paul had to tell them not to hang out with sexually immoral people. All right, that's right. So we don't have that letter, but for sure he said that. Okay, we'll come back to that later. So we don't know who sent the letter, in terms of who delivered it and so forth, but Paul wrote a letter to them. Okay, where's Paul again when he wrote this letter? He's still in Ephesus for 2 years and 3 months. So he's still in Ephesus for 2 years and 3 months, and he gets 2 pieces of information about them, all right? two pieces of information about them. I don't know what order they come in. Okay, one could be before the other, but these are the two pieces of information. We do know that the Corinthians wrote to Paul. How do I know that? Well, that's easy to prove. I just have you after this seminar look in your Bible in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 1, and you'll read, Paul says, "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote." It's pretty obvious, right? Okay. So they wrote to him a letter, and you can see 7:1, they wrote to him about married people, whether they can have sex together or whether they shouldn't have sex together. That's what he talks about there. Some of you are looking, it's in the Bible, just look it up. Okay, and if your spouse dies, should you remarry again, that kind of thing, all right? And then 7:25, they apparently asked him about their virgins, their single daughters. Should they remain single or should they get married? Paul talks about that. 8:1, what about meat sacrificed to idols? They asked a question about that, and Paul took 3 whole chapters to answer that. 12:1, they talked about spiritual gifts or spiritual people. 16:1, this collection, Paul, that you're trying to make, they weren't on board, but they asked a question about the collection. And 16:12, they asked about a guy named Apollos. So you're learning tonight that the Corinthians wrote Paul a letter when he was in Ephesus for 2 years and 3 months, okay? Now, I also want you to not just imagine this letter, but I want you to know the tone of this letter, okay? The letter that they wrote to Paul was not at all something like this. Dear Apostle Paul, right? We so value your insight and opinion, right, that we have a bunch of matters we're wrestling about, right? And we eagerly wait for your... that's not what it wrote. Okay? The letter was more something like this. Paul, when you were here, you said this. You said that everything is permissible. So then why now are you giving us a hard time about doing everything that is permissible? Okay, so Paul has to come back and later on say, well, yes, I did say everything was permissible, but that doesn't mean everything is beneficial, right? Okay. So I want you to understand that they're writing him a letter and there's tension in this letter, right? They're kind of giving him a hard time. So that's the one piece of information. I told you there are two pieces of information that Paul gets about them. You ready for the second one? It's not as happy. Not that the first one was very good. Okay? He gets an oral report about them. How do I know that? Well, it says right there in chapter 1 of 1 Corinthians, it has been reported to me by those of Chloe that da-da-da-da-da-da. Who is Chloe? Chloe is a rich businesswoman, and it seems like some of her workers or slaves, likely from Ephesus, have traveled across the Aegean and connected with the Christians in Corinth, and they saw some things like, and then they came back, and then they told Paul about. What did they tell Paul about? Well, they told Paul that there are divisions in the church. They're badly divided. Paul wasn't too happy about that. They said, Paul, there are 2 members of the church who have a fight against each other, and instead of dealing with it in-house, they're going to the secular courts. Paul wasn't too happy about that. They said, Paul, would you believe that there's a man in the Corinthian church who has a sexual relationship with his stepmother? Not his natural mother, but his stepmother. Paul wasn't too happy about that. And apparently there were some Christians in Corinth who thought that it was okay to have sex with prostitutes, and that wasn't a problem. Paul wasn't so happy about that either. These are all things, by the way, that the Corinthians just conveniently didn't mention in the letter that they wrote to Paul. That makes sense, doesn't it? Okay. So where's Paul again, just in case you forgot? Where is he? He's still in Ephesus for 2 years and 3 months, and he just got these 2 pieces of information, right? They wrote him a letter, kind of contesting with Paul, giving him a bunch of questions, a hard time about some things, and he just heard some shocking things about them. So what does Paul do? He writes a letter. Yeah, okay. And that is our 1 Corinthians, which is really letter number 2. That's right. And this letter, if you mapped it out, falls into these 2 halves that I just told you about. The first half of the letter, chapters 1 through 6, Paul responds to the things he heard about. And Paul is especially kind of angry or hot in this part of the letter. He's quite sarcastic and biting at this time. Because in his mind, this is like embarrassing stuff. It's like, are you kidding me? You know what I mean, right? I mean, so Paul's kind of angry, in the first half. And then we get to the second half, and he's still not happy with them. But it's a little tricky for him because, they are sometimes saying some things that are true, like everything is permissible, but they're implementing it in ways that are not helpful, right? So Paul writes our 1 Corinthians, which is really actually letter number 2, okay? And there goes the letter, right? Paul is still in Ephesus, right? We don't know who delivered it. We can make some educated guesses, but the letter goes across the Aegean, and there it is in Corinth. Something's happening with Timothy, but in the interest of time, I'll just skip over that. So Paul is still in Ephesus for 2 years and 3 months. Seemingly, the situation in the Corinthian church is not so healthy, judging by what Paul heard and the need for a letter. And then things get worse. There's kind of like a hostile takeover. The church is invaded, and we really don't know who these people are. Paul makes references to false apostles and super apostles and those who undermine the authority of Paul. We're just not sure. But the really painful part for Paul is the Corinthian church said, "We like you guys. You guys are much more exciting to us and pleasing to us than our founding pastor, Paul." Did you catch that? I could say, have you ever founded a church? Probably not, right? But just imagine, you led people to Christ. You've been laboring for a year and a half, right? I mean, and then your spiritual children, we want nothing to do with you, okay, right? I mean, just think about that. So Paul is in Ephesus for 2 years and 3 months, and he hears about this hostile takeover. And it's not so much that he's hurt, although he is, but he's really concerned about their spiritual welfare. So it's not just like a vanity thing, like they like those other people more than me, but he's really concerned about the bad theology that these other leaders who have hijacked the church are advocating. So what does Paul do? He makes a visit that you don't read about in the book of Acts. Did you catch what I just said? So in other words, you have those study Bibles with all those nice maps, right? You'll never ever see this line that I had to physically put on this PowerPoint, right? So Paul makes like an emergency visit, right? He calls it a painful visit because it turns out to be painful. But there goes Paul. He's sailing across the Aegean. It's not so hard to do. He goes to the church that he founded. He was there for a year and a half, and guess what? The church says, "Who are you? You're like yesterday's guy, okay? We don't like you, Paul, okay, right?" So now Paul has to go. This is still during the 2 years and 3 months. Now, just think about the emotions. I mean, that's got to hurt, right? Now, I also find it interesting that if Paul were in a church like that today, what do we do as pastors? We just say, well, I'm going to move on. I'm going to forget about you guys, okay? Wouldn't you want to do that? I mean, that's what we do in our circles. I see our pastor over here, right? If we have a bad situation in a church, well, I'm just going to take a call to another church and wash my hands and, you know what I mean, right? I mean, that would be the easy thing to do. Paul doesn't do that, does he? So Paul comes back to Ephesus, still 2 years and 3 months, and it hurts. I mean, man, my own spiritual children are dissing me like this. I mean, I can't, this is really bad. So what does Paul do? He doesn't give up on them. That's the interesting thing. But he writes them another letter. This is our 3 Corinthians, which we don't have. Right? We can call it the Tearful Letter because Paul says he had tears when he wrote it. And it was a nasty letter. I mean, it had strong language. Paul kind of admits that the language was so hot, was so severe, that he almost regretted writing it. Almost. So this is not good. Paul says, I've already written to them a couple of times, right? Okay, it hasn't worked before. What likelihood do I think it's going to work this time? Anyway, I'm going to make sure I send it with somebody good. And when you're in trouble, who are you going to call? Not Ghostbusters, but you're going to call Titus. Titus is a mature apostle, okay? And so Paul is in Ephesus. He gives this harsh letter to Titus and says, Titus, thank you for doing this, you know what I mean? I'm not too optimistic about it, but God can do amazing things, right? Okay, I'm praying for you, right? I'm eager to hear what might happen, Titus. And Paul waves goodbye, and Titus goes to Corinth. And there's Paul. I mean, he's still got other things going on, but what about my spiritual children in Corinth? What's happening over there? Not too optimistic. I wouldn't be. Let's skip over that too. That's just a little bit of details. So anyway, Paul is, how long was he in Ephesus for again? 2 years and 3 months. This is part of the third missionary journey. So at the end of this 2 years and 3 months, seemingly because Paul was waiting for Titus to come back. Okay, so apparently Titus was going to be going by land. You see that kind of circle, all right? And there was some arrangement for Titus to come back. And Paul said something like, I couldn't stand it anymore. And so he said goodbye to the Christians in Ephesus. And he starts going north to Troas. Remember Troas? The very place where on the second missionary journey, we're on the third one, where he had the vision of the Macedonian man, okay? So Paul is now on the third missionary journey. He's in Troas, and he looks around and no Titus. Apparently Titus, right? Shoot. So what does Paul do? I guess he sails from Troas to Philippi, just like he did on the second missionary journey. And we don't know where, but somewhere in Macedonia. What's Macedonia? The northern parts of Greece. So somewhere in Philippi, Thessaloniki, Berea, somewhere up there, Paul meets Titus. And aren't you curious about what Titus said? What do you think? Yeah, he's really surprised. Okay, do I have it over here, right? He says, by there, no peace of mind because I did not find my brother Titus there. So he comes and surprise, surprise, God's grace has been at work in this letter, this tearful letter, which we don't have anymore. Maybe it's a good thing. Anyway, God worked through this means and apparently, they're remorseful and they're willing to submit to Paul's leadership. And Paul's like, wow, I can't believe it. In fact, maybe he can't quite believe it, actually. Because he doesn't, I don't know if that's why or not, but he doesn't make a beeline for Corinth. That's where he's heading, but he doesn't go there right away. For whatever reason, either because he's going to be a while, he writes a letter. This would be letter number 4, right? Okay, do I have it over here? There it is, which is really our 2 Corinthians. And the first 7 chapters of this letter is like Paul's, I'm trying to be funny. I was going to say Paul's like drugs because he's like in a good mood or something. That's the wrong analogy. But I mean, Paul's like, yay, yay, yay. You know what I mean? I'm so comforted. I'm so excited because Titus came back and yay, yay, yay. My spiritual children are singing a different tune. Yay, yay, yay. Isn't that great? But it must not have been 100% great because you get to chapters 8 and 9 and 10, 11, and 12, and 13 and So I need to tell you, I've alluded to it already. On the third missionary journey, right, from Ephesus on, Paul is putting together a collection, a big collection from all of his churches. His predominantly, what ethnic group? His predominantly Gentile churches. And Paul's going to take that money and bring it to Jerusalem. That's a big master plan that's going on over here. And there's a lot at stake. It's not just finances over here. How do I know that? Because later on when Paul writes to the Romans, second time, right? Paul says to the Romans, I want to come see you. In fact, I'm planning to come to see you, but first I've got to bring this collection to the Christians in Palestine, right? And then he says something interesting. He says, pray that they will accept it. Did you catch that? So pray that the Jewish Christians who are in need will accept the financial gift that you Gentiles Christians give. Now, I'm just a little bit puzzled by that because even if I'm not in need and somebody comes with a boatload of cash, I usually say thanks. Okay, right? I mean, isn't that the natural reaction, right? So in other words, there's a lot more at stake because there's tension between the Jewish wing of the church and the Gentile wing of the church. And I think that Paul wants his collection, and by the way, representatives from the churches giving the money are also with him. So he's picking up people and cash along the way. Paul's going to end up showing up in Jerusalem with a lot of cash and with Gentile Jesus followers. And he hopes that'll be impossible for the Jewish Jesus followers not to recognize that the Gentile Jesus followers are authentic. If they weren't authentic, they wouldn't have traveled all that way. They wouldn't have given this money. So there's a lot at stake in the collection. It's not just benevolence, okay? It's not like these people are poor, help. No, there's more at stake. Why am I telling you about this? Well, I've already told you, the Corinthians weren't contributing up to this point. Well, it's not surprising. We have that expression in English. We say money talks, right? Or sometimes we say put your money where your, right? And so the fact that the Corinthians had not up to this point committed themselves to this collection says something about their relationship to Paul, right? And money is talking. Their reluctance means that they weren't on board. They weren't fully supportive on Paul. So now in chapters 8 and 9, it's almost like Paul is throwing the gauntlet down a little bit, right? So Titus came and told me that you guys have had a change of heart. Yay, yay, yay. Praise God. Wonderful, right? And now he spends 2 whole chapters, something like saying, now, here's your chance to prove your genuineness, right? To put your money where your mouth is to join in the collection, yeah. By the way, whenever it's budget time over here at Valley Presbyterian, okay, right? This is where Pastor David would probably go to. Because, Paul's pretty skilled at kind of just maneuvering, right? And saying, now, wait a minute, you should think about money this way, and you should give, and so forth. So it's a great 2-chapter fundraising, if you want to just look at that, what Paul says and does during this period. And then we have chapters 10, 11, 12, and 13. Scholars have been struck how the tone at the end of the letter isn't so raw, and positive at the end. And so, where is Paul now? Remember, he's not in Ephesus anymore. He's somewhere in northern Greece. He's in Macedonia, right? Timothy came with the good news, and now Paul has written a letter. The 4th letter, our 2nd letter, all right? And apparently Titus is going to be delivering that while Paul continues up north for a while. Okay, he's finally done up north for a while. Some other things happen over there. And Paul finally makes it to the city of Corinth, which according to Acts is only his 2nd time there. But now you know better than that. You know that this is actually his 3rd visit. Remember? Because he had that emergency visit across, right? So this is on the 3rd missionary journey. It's his 3rd visit to Corinth. And so Paul is with them for how long? For 3 months. Almost certainly because that's the winter season, waiting for the Mediterranean to calm down. Virtually no sailing takes place during the winter season, which of course Paul found out the hard way. He knew that already, right? The ship captain, remember when he went to Rome? That happened during the winter season. They pushed their luck too far. So they wait for 3 months, and then Paul is ready to go on a boat and sail with all the money that he's been collecting, and with the representatives, the Gentile representatives, on a ship to Jerusalem in order to be there for Pentecost when there's a threat against his life. And so he has a change of plans, and so instead of going east by boat, he starts going by land. He backtracks over to Macedonia. Do you see him going back up there? So you have the arrow coming through blue on the one way. You need to see the red arrow going back. See, that's on the return leg. He gets to Philippi, and I haven't mentioned him yet, but Dr. Luke has been there for 7 years. Remember, the gospel comes to Philippi, and they had the 4 of them, and they went, I said to you, Dr. Luke is left behind, okay? And 7 years later, right at this spot, Dr. Luke seems to join them. And then Paul ultimately ends up in Jerusalem and brings the gift. And there's a disturbance against Paul in the temple. He's arrested. And anyway, that's how he ends up ultimately 2 years in Caesarea in prison. And then he pulls out his, not his visa card, but he pulls out his Roman citizenship. And he appeals to Caesar, and then he goes after that boat crash and everything, and he's 2 years over there and so forth. So I think this is, let me see over here. That's right. That was the last slide, but I think there's some questions. So Brothers and sisters, whenever you read 1 Corinthians in the future, whenever you read 2 Corinthians in the future, if you ever look at Acts 18, the gospel comes to Corinth, you need to realize that there's a long and complicated, not a happy story between Paul and this church. There were times when it was up, but there were a lot of times when it was down. Now, the end of the story, where we leave off, seemingly is good. But part of that narrative is explained when you look at 1 and 2 Corinthians more carefully. So look at that. I've never had this much time in any of the 3 weeks for questions. What are we going to do for 15 minutes? Well, hopefully you're brave enough to ask a question. So the mics are open, and preferably questions having to do with Paul and the Corinthians, but I could take another question, about Paul and his life, or maybe something from the other week. So here we go. Wait a second. So it's recorded for others too? Try it again. There.
You talked about Corinth being a large area, many home churches maybe around. So how did Paul know who was corresponding with him when these letters were going back and forth? The people that were acting not accordingly.
Well, okay, let me see if I answer your question. You can have a follow-up. So, first of all, again, Corinth as a city is a major city, okay? Yeah. I already said 80 to 100,000. All kinds of traffic east and west is going through these two harbors and over the land. That's another very interesting story. It really is cool. I love taking people to Corinth because there's all kinds of ways where the geography and the history of the city overlaps with things in the letters. For instance, the games. You've all heard of the Olympic Games, haven't you? How many of you heard of the Corinthian Games? Okay, well, actually, they weren't called the Corinthian Games, but they were sponsored by Corinth. They're called the Isthmian Games. They were held every 2 years. Oh, Paul was in Corinth for how long? A year and a half. So it's an excellent chance that his year and a half overlapped with the Corinthian Games. And it's not surprising that the first metaphor of athletics is in 1 Corinthians, right? In chapter 9, Paul says, don't you know that all athletes compete for the prize, but only one gets to win? And they do it to receive a perishable crown. It's wrong. It should be perishable wreath, because the victorious athlete would get a wreath of flowers or of certain greenery, right? Paul says we run the spiritual race to receive an imperishable crown and so forth, right? So there are all kinds of ways in which this big city and life in that big city we know about impacts the Corinthian letters. So now your question is, and I'm getting there slowly. So the mother church, I'll say it that way, the mother church is in Corinth, right? And from the mother church, other churches are being started. We know for sure there was one in nearby Cenchrea. Remember Phoebe from Cenchrea? And he mentions other Christians in Achaia. So there must have been other baby churches, just like Ephesus was the mother church with surrounding ones, right? So the letter that Paul got, he clearly identifies with Corinth. Now, whether they listed in the letter, which we don't have, right, particular names or so forth, but clearly the leadership in the mother church, okay, the leadership in the mother church, right, is over against Paul and has gone to these other people. And so maybe Paul had other supporters, right, but remember, we don't have actually in 1 Corinthians, Paul says, not many of you were of noble birth. Not many of you were of power and so forth. What I'm trying to say is the majority of the Christians were of lower class, right, with just a few of upper class. So let's imagine you're a lower class Jesus follower in Corinth, right? You don't have a lot of money or clout really to write a letter to Paul, right? So maybe he did have some supporters. But the leadership, the movers and shakers of the Corinthian mother church, right, were clearly at odds with their spiritual father, Paul, and hence this tension back and forth, yeah. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yes. Can I sit down?
Sure, yeah. I just thought in case I didn't, you'd have a follow-up one, that's all, yeah. By the way, I'm not kidding about children, right? Because it's in 1 Corinthians 4 where Paul says, these other spiritual leaders, right, they're only nannies. You know what a nanny is, right? Okay, he says, compared to me, I'm your father, right? Who's your daddy, Paul says in 1 Corinthians. I mean, that's strong language, because he's writing to the Corinthians. Like, wait a minute, those other leaders like Apollos and Peter and all the other ones who maybe came, okay, they're not the same as me. I'm the one who led you to Christ. I'm your spiritual father. I mean, that's part of Paul's frustration, right, when he's when he's talking. We can see that in 1 Corinthians.
Jeff, I'm just curious. I must have the wrong characterization of Paul. In reading all of his letters, I saw this bold, fearless guy who made a great impact, obviously. And what I'm seeing here tonight is a lot of frustration, maybe indecision, and stop-start things. That surprises me. It doesn't seem to be consistent with my vision of him. So correct me and explain that to me.
Yeah. Well, that's a great observation. I think, even though we're not Catholic, because if we were Catholics, we would just call Paul Paul. We'd say Saint Paul. Okay, right? So even though we're Protestants and we don't say Saint Paul, we think Paul's an apostle, right? He's an inspired writer of Scripture. And because we grew up thinking we have to listen to someone like that, we sometimes wrongly assume that everybody else had that same mentality, right? That's what I think, right? We grew up in a church and we're like, oh, Paul said this. Everybody goes, oh yeah, okay, right? That's us today. But that doesn't mean that it was the way back then. And we have lots of evidences, right, that wasn't the case. So the Galatian letters are another great example, right? Even worse over there, right? Yes, there are good relations. Philippi, his good relations with Philippi. Good relations with the church in Thessalonica, right? Bad relations in the Galatian churches, and a growing tension in Corinth. So you and I maybe need to nuance our understanding a little bit, probably just because we grew up in the church and we had this maybe lofty version of the Apostle Paul, right? Sometimes Christians are uncomfortable thinking about Paul in that earthly way. I mean, maybe not you. I was preaching a couple of years ago at rural churches are sometimes more conservative, that's fair to say. Anyway, I think I told you this story. Maybe I did, but if I do, it's relevant now. So I said there was a very stern-looking guy on the way out. We shake hands, and he said in your sermon to me, he said, it was on Paul. He said, you said Paul said this, and Paul said that. You should have said God said this, and God said that, right? See, because that's a person who, like you, probably grew up with a very high view of Scripture, right? And even though we don't call him Saint Paul, right, he's this super apostle, this great guy, okay, he's perfect and marvelous, and and so maybe we have to nuance our understanding and say that he was a strong personality. There's no question about that. He wasn't a wallflower. He was a gifted guy. He went to the Harvard School of Judaism, no less, right? Okay, so yes, but he was a real human person, right? And he was hurt, right? I mean, when his spiritual children, didn't follow through, just like we parents are hurt sometimes when our adult kids do things and say things that hurt us. I mean, so we just maybe need to kind of flesh out that more human side of the inspiration process. So thanks for the question. I liked it. So, okay. We got time for both. There we go. You go first, Fran, and then, yeah.
I'm still back in Thessalonica.
In Thessalonica, okay, yes, that was
2 weeks ago.
3 weeks, yeah.
Paul and Silas, as it says in Acts 17:4, some Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did many Greeks and not a few prominent women. And I've been wondering this for 2 weeks now. Do we know who these prominent women were, and how did they become prominent?
Okay.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I can talk a little bit about it. I can't be super specific, but so it's clear now in Thessalonica. So that's week number 2, right? But as we saw in a lot of places, Paul goes to the synagogue, right? And not surprisingly, who are in the synagogue? Jewish people. And some of those Jewish people were persuaded. Remember, we made the point, Paul didn't persuade them. Some of them were persuaded. Remember, I made the point that God is really the actor over here, right? So, okay, so some of them are Jews who become Jesus followers, right? Then the next category, right, is God-fearers. I don't know if we've talked about God-fearers. God-fearers, I think we have. Those are Gentiles. You were saying, what's a Gentile doing in a synagogue? And I said to you, well, wasn't common. I said most Gentiles, not all. Most Gentiles thought Jews were weird and strange, okay, right? I mean, who goes around cutting off the foreskin of your penis? I mean, that sounds crazy, okay? So that's one reason why a lot of people thought they were that. Plus, they keep to themselves, right, okay? Plus, they're a little suspicious whether they're truly patriotic and stuff. So while most Gentiles wanted nothing to do with, right, I said to you, as far as I can tell, because of the antiquity of the Jewish religion and because of its ethics and morals, some Greeks or non-Jews were attracted, right? So that's the second group. Now, Luke mentions the third group, not a few prominent women, okay? So, now, first of all, that's a special way of speaking. Not a few means, I mean, it's a way, it means quite a few. Now, it doesn't say whether they were part of the Greeks, right? It's more likely they were part of the Jewish community because lots of Jews reach positions of money and power and so forth. And so we don't have names, but it looks like among the synagogue members, probably among their Jewish members, there were some wealthy people, right? And we don't know whether the women were wealthy in of themselves or they were married to someone who's wealthy. Okay, you can't quite tell that from the text, but they were prominent anyway. And some of those were also converted. And Luke, we said a little bit of that last week, right? If I can make it in Athens, right, I can make it. So Luke is always trying to show that, it's not just stupid poor people who are attracted to the gospel, right? Not a few prominent women. Right? So he's just showing that people in higher positions of culture and society were also attracted. Okay? So it's one of those three categories of people that are mentioned. We don't know their names. We do know that, well, we have inscriptions, actually we have inscription of a woman who was a synagogue leader. It's kind of interesting. So we don't have names in Thessalonica, but we do know from other places that they were women, either married to men of prominent position or women who in themselves, and some of those were converted. And that, by the way, would get the attention, right, of the synagogue people, right? It'd be bad enough Paul stole members, but if he's stealing rich members, if he's stealing powerful members, it's even worse, right? I feel bad for 2-3 weeks you've been, okay, are we off that now? Are we the burden? Oh, good. Phew. All right, good. All right.
I've been thinking about this a lot. What happened to the Jews who became Christians? They're not there anymore.
What do you mean by what happened to them?
What happened? It's
you mean historically? Or?
Yeah, historically. We have, for the most part, I don't know, Christian Jews.
Uh-huh.
So what happened?
Well,
you said that some of them became Christians,
yes.
but the Samaritans were the people who were non-Jews who became Christians to me and survived.
Uh-huh. Well, the Samaritans, of course, claimed to be children of Abraham, right? So they would kind of claim some identity with Judaism. But so I can say something about in the early centuries, and then I don't know if I can be much more clear for more recent times. But so in a number of circles, it looks like Jews who converted to Christianity, right? Okay. A number of those still kept their membership in the local synagogue, okay? And first of all, that is kind of expected because social ties are pretty strong and it would be quite dramatic to cut off. So I could imagine there'd be a temptation just to keep up membership, right? Even though you're now a Christian Jew, right? But there's a second very practical reason, and it kind of relates to something we've talked about, and that's why I want before, and that's why I want to mention it again. Remember that Christianity is not an officially recognized religion, but Judaism is, okay? So in other words, that allowed Christian Jews in particular, right, to keep their membership in the synagogue, which would garner them a little bit of protection, right? If you follow what I'm saying, right? So if you're asking what happened, right, it looks like they kept up that membership for a while. And we know that this happened for maybe as long as the whole first century, until finally the Jewish leaders looked at this phenomenon and said, this is no good, right? People like Gallio, right? They don't see the difference between us Jews and Well, they didn't call it Christians. They called them Nazarenes, right? The follower of the Nazarene. And so then they took they did something too. In 90, we're not 100% sure, but it's alluded to in the Gospel of John, and there's a Council of Jamnia. So the Jews got together. It's on a coastal city in Israel, and they kind of took an official action to kick out Nazarenes out of their fellowship. But that means that they were in the fellowship until 90 AD. Do you catch what I'm getting at, right? And that afforded them some protections. So that at least answers your question, what happened to them at least up to about the first century. Mm-hmm. But then you kind of went on, I think you're asking about what about till today, right? And well, there are Jewish Christians. Some of them are found just in, regular churches, but we also have, Jews for Jesus and some organizations like that. But you're right, there aren't tons of Jews, right? Jewish Christians.
I have a feeling about this, and I may be all wrong. The Jews were the chosen people, and they did not choose Jesus, even though he comes back to save everyone and perhaps the Jews. So they disregard him. I think he came back for us. I really do. I believe that, if you think about the whole idea of the first coming and the Jews are chosen and they do all these things, and then he comes again because nothing seems to be working, and then he comes for us. And no one talks about that to me in the same way because he was Jewish.
So I'm
It's
almost
too
saved
much.
by the bell. Not quite.
Yeah,
So,
okay.
But what you're doing, you're raising a very disputed question, right? I think I hear you saying, what is the destiny of the Jewish people, all right? And on this answer, there's been lots of controversy, right? So that's why I'm not trying to be ambiguous. I'm just saying there's different opinions on that. And there are different texts that come up, right? Because Paul will say in Romans 11, I think it's verse 25, and so all Israel will be saved. That's a highly disputed verse, okay, and so forth. But, there are different nuances because Paul will earlier in chapter 9 say, not all Israel is Israel. It's kind of interesting. So then the question is Paul saying that the church is the new Israel, right? I mean, that's another interpretation, right? There are other Christians saying, no. God has a special place for the Jews in the future, right? And I'm hesitant to wade into a highly charged, controversial discussion when I'm 2 minutes over. Okay? So what I'm saying is, I don't feel your pain, but I do hear your question. And I'm saying there are different answers to that question, right? Right? Okay. And there are a lot of resources. It wouldn't be hard for you to kind of track that out because you may not have heard much about it, but a lot of Christians have been asking that question and thinking about it. So it shouldn't be hard for you to kind of think some more with some help of others about what is the fate of the Jewish people, right?
Well, at least I could ask it.
At least you could ask it. That's right. I hoped I'd answered it just a little bit. But anyway, brothers and sisters, not only is our time for today done, but this is the end of 4 weeks. And so, and that means that I have to leave. I'm leaving at 4 tomorrow morning. I'm hopping in the car, and my wife and I will spend the next day and 3/4 on the road all the way back to Michigan. So thankfully the weather looks pretty good. And thankfully my wife and I love each other, and we do pretty well in the car together for a long period of time. But I'm not so excited about leaving the sunshine and the beauty of Arizona. I'm not so excited about leaving my friends here at Valley Presbyterian. So thank you for your attendance for these 4 weeks, and I hope that in God's providence, maybe next January we can meet again. And if you have any follow-up questions, you have my email, right? And I will be very happy to hear from you and respond in any way. Oh, sorry. Can you put on this over?
If you like to travel, go with this man. He took us to Turkey. Educational, inspirational, and fun. We loved him. He's the best tour guide I've ever had, and I've been around.
Well, thank you. Oh, there we go, Pat. good. So anyway, blessings to you all, right? And I hope to hear from you either online or, again, in God's providence, maybe next January. So.
Oh, please, brother. You'll be in our prayers.
Okay.
Yeah. And next week we'll be switching classes. So Dr. or Pastor Turner will be teaching a class on the Beatitudes, and then we'll also be hosting a class on our mission partners as well. So we'll still keep our Oasis going, but please be praying for our brother, Dr. Weima, as you travel home. So thank you so much.
Good. Thank you.